guys, Cody and Tracy here at SCC Fitness, and today we're going to start a new video series, and we're going to dive into the glutes, all right? So we're going to do a 4-part series on the glutes. Today we're going to talk a little bit about anatomy and function and something we call reciprocal inhibition. So we're going to go over those things, kind of dive into each muscle and make sure you understand them.
Not only that, we have to talk about glute size. This is a very big muscle in the body, and ladies, especially the ladies, you want a little size on that because it makes it stronger. So when we talk about this, make sure that you're not shying away because you want a smaller size trunk.
It's very true. You think of just how much we take the glutes for granted. Our glutes are probably one of our favorite muscles, just strictly from the standpoint of we really can't function without them. You think of how much our glutes do for us on a daily basis. I mean, walking, running, standing up out of a chair, we wouldn't be able to do a lot of that stuff without our glutes. So definitely an important muscle to make sure it's strong and not small.
Right. So the one that you complain about, hopefully we can give you some background of why you want to make sure that these are active.
All right, guys, so the first thing we're going to talk about today is reciprocal inhibition. So it's just basically a big fancy way of saying an overactive or tight muscle will shut off an underactive or lengthened muscle. So I always think of this as being on opposite sides of a joint. All right, so for our terms of talking about glutes, we're going to talk specifically about our hip flexors and our psoas being tight and overactive, and that will actually shut off our glutes and not allow them to function while we're doing our movement. So that's how we develop compensation patterns. So that's the first thing we need to talk about today. It's always important as we go through our video series here, we're going to talk about glute activation drills and how to incorporate glutes into your workouts and how they are involved in movements you do in the gym. But it's always important to make sure we get rid of reciprocal inhibition first before we do glute activation drills. So that means you need to do hip flexor stretches, good quality warm-ups, stretch that psoas out before you do your glute activation drills, before you go into the big bulk of your workout, if you will. So that way your glutes are functioning like they should. All right, so then we're going to talk a little bit about glute max. All right, so this is the big guy. This is the big glute. It's basically your butt. All right, so we're going to start by talking a little bit about where it begins and where it inserts, basically. So you want to think of along your tailbone, right to where that crest of your hip. All right, so we got a nice big crest here on your hip. As that comes down by your tailbone, all right, that's where your glute attaches. That down on your tailbone up to where that crest starts, and then it comes down and it attaches to the, it's called the lesser trochanter of your femur. So the head of your femur, that ball on the outside of your hip, if you will, it'll attach right there on that attachment point. So that guy is a really important muscle. It does, two of its major functions are extension, all right? So I'll have Tracy demonstrate those. So picture her arm as her leg, all right? So extension would be straight or pulling that hip or leg behind you, all right? Its other function is external rotation. So taking the front of your femur and rotating out, all right? So those are the two biggest functions of your glute max. So if you think of those in terms of exercises, think of hip extension, deadlift, squat, standing up from your lunge, all those things. External rotation, you're going to think of in your squat position, how do you get to your toes out that we talked about in our live post this week. You got to externally rotate, those types of things. So that's how we're getting that muscle to turn on and function.
All right, guys, we're going to talk about the glute medius, the problem child of the glutes. It is origin here, sits at the crest, so it comes around the crest of your ilium, okay, and it comes down and it attaches to the greater trochanter, which is that bump is at the outside of your hip. You probably can see in the video a little bit better on Cody's a little bit taller than I am. So
she said it, not me.
But this problem child tends to shut off because it is a stabilizer of the hip. A lot of moms, we have our baby sitting on our hip, and so it kicks out. How does this work in the gym? So it's an external rotator. So as Cody, I showed you before, and he'll show you here, it externally rotates. But when we are doing anything single leg, so if he's gonna stand on a single leg here, he wants to make sure that his hip doesn't kick out. So again, making sure that we do corrective exercises to get this bad boy to fire up before we start doing any kind of single leg movement.
All right, guys, so we got our third muscle in our glute complex, if you will. We're gonna talk about glute minimus, all right? This guy is a little bit of an a-hole, all right? So when he gets overactive and greedy and wants to do most of the work, it really starts to shut things off, which now we have compensation patterns. All right, so we get some referred pain due to it. So what does he do and why does he get a little pissed off? All right, and that's because of his friends. We'll talk about that in a sec. But let's start with origin and insertion. All right, so he originates along the crest of your hip, all right, so just a little bit below where the glute med, we just talked about that, where that guy attaches, all right, and then he comes down and attaches down to the greater trochanter. So you notice common theme, all three attach to the head of that femur, all right, so they're all hip joint actions that we're talking about here with these muscles. But when you start to think of all three of them, think of them in layers. So glute max is the outside or the shape of your butt. Glute med is kind of in the middle layer, and the glute min would be inside, closest to your bone structure, all right? So why is this guy a little bit of an a-hole? All right, so he's got different functions or joint actions than the other ones do, all right? So glute min does hip flexion, all right, does hip abduction, and then also does hip internal rotation. There you go. So you notice it's actually kind of the exact opposite of the other two muscles we covered.
Correct.
All right, and he has a little bit more of a relationship in terms of his joint action as hip flexors and psoas. All right, so now think of how much we're sitting at desks all day long. We go home, we sit and watch TV. We sit in the car to get home to watch TV. So the amount of time that those muscles spend shortened, they get really tight, overactive. And so the more they get tight and overactive, like we talked about before with reciprocal inhibition, they shut off our glute max, glute med. All right, so that's why this guy's a little bit of a grade A-hole when it comes to our glute complex, if you will. So this is a muscle you actually don't want to do some strengthening for. You actually want to do some stretching, release work, foam roll this guy. So really focus on foam rolling TFL, tensor fascial latte, your glute min. Get those guys loosened up the best you can so you can improve the function of your glute max, glute med when you do your glute activation drills and your bigger movements when you're actually lifting.
All right, guys, as we talked about reciprocal inhibition, we want to talk about having you shut them off, and these are some great ways to shut them off. But you want to make sure that before you go into this stretch, you always do your mobility work or your foam rolling first, okay? So I'm going to have Cody get into position here. And the closer he can get his knee to his anchor point, the harder the stretch is, the more intense it'll feel. Now this is about an 18-inch flip it. You can always use a medicine ball as you're starting this off to get a little bit of the stretch. So as you can see, his hip is over his knee. What I'm wanting him to do is not lean his body forward, okay? Because again, that's what we're trying to avoid is that flexion. So I want him to think about squeezing his glutes and driving that hip forward. And you're gonna stay here between 30 seconds to 2 minutes because it takes a while for you to get that release. As you start to find that release in this position, you can intensify this by bringing the arm up of the knee that is down and leaning slightly over. Okay, and that's going to also increase the intensity of this stretch. Again, you want to hold this until you feel a release. You don't want to just think, I'm pressed for time, I'm going to do this for 30 seconds and I'm going to be fine, I'm going to get out of it. You want that to feel that release, and it's not as painful to be in this position about 2 minutes in.
All right, guys, so that is installment one. A lot of information about your glutes, anatomy, function, reciprocal inhibition, as well as a little bit of a hip flexor psoas release. So a lot of information in there. Make sure you check out the whole video a second time if you need to. But it's really good information to build off of for the rest of this video series on the glutes. All right, next week we're gonna come back, we're gonna talk about glute activation drills. So how do we get them firing after we do our psoas stretch and get those hip flexors loosened up. So that way once we go to our bigger movements, they're functioning and they're able to help out with those movements, all right? If you have any questions, you know where to find us, 105 West Milwaukee Street here in Janesville. Otherwise, you can call us, shoot us an email, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, website. All right, if you have any questions, let us know. Thanks, guys.